Thank you, brother. I'm glad that the Lord led you all to us. You guys have been a blessing to us as well. Singing that song, Sweet, Sweet Spirit, I don't know about you. Every time I sing that song, let me tell you what comes to my mind. Youth evangelism conferences when I was a kid. Because we sang a lot back in the 70s during that period of time, and so forth. But every time I sing that song, I think about the youth evangelism conferences and all those kinds of things. So good memories, beautiful song, great truth. So welcome. It is good to see y'all. And aren't you glad we're indoors doing this? Nobody would have shown up if I'd planned an outdoor service up there at the... I've thought about doing some outdoor services on Wednesday evening, when we get to fall and stuff. And then when we get to fall, I forget it. But I don't think anybody would have shown today. So I'm glad that you're here. All right, so we're going to be in Judges chapter 8 tonight. And so as we get started, I've got the map up here. And it's like I told Chuck. He was up here looking at the map a minute ago. And I said, don't try to read the fine print on there because you're not going to see it. I've tried to find a better map where the print shows up, the smaller print, but this is the best one that I've found that lays out the tribes and so forth. And so we started with that with Joshua. But here's what I want to do, just real quick. I'm going to be making reference to several different locations on the map this evening, and so rather than me getting up while I'm in the middle of all that, I thought I'd go ahead and point out a few things. So if you've got your map with you, or maybe open your Bible to the back, and you probably have a Bible map in there, and you probably have one that's got the tribe allotments on there. But several things I want to call attention to. First of all, and we're going to do a little bit of review from the last time I was with you when we were in Judges a couple of weeks ago. And by the way, I got to say thanks to Terry Adams for filling in last week. Appreciate him doing that. Just want to call attention to the location of Asher, the tribe of Asher, Naphtali, West Manasseh, because those are the tribes that Gideon originally called on to go and do battle with the Midianites when they started on that crusade. Ephraim, he calls on a little bit later, but there's an issue that comes up with Ephraim that we'll talk about this evening. In fact, it'll be the very first thing that we're going to cover. Then I want to kind of mention a couple of cities, locations. One thing I'm going to be making reference to is the city of Nain. Remember Jesus, he talks about the widow of Nain, raises this woman's son and everything. And it's right up here in Issachar, right in this area right here. So the green area, that's sort of where all this stuff kind of got started with the Midianites, okay? And then, as we make our way further on into the study, there is Sukkoth, which is down here, right at the Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan. And then east of Sukkoth, there, along the next river, I can't remember the name right there, Penuel, all right? And then not marked on there is another city, Karkor, that we'll be making mention of, and they're all just right along that line right there. So Sukkoth, Penuel, and then Karkor, and there's Mahanaim, and so it's in between there. So I wanted to go ahead and kind of just point those out so that when we get into the study, I don't necessarily have to stop and try to point those out to you. So I hope you can remember all that. All right, there's going to be a test at the end of the study. All right, that chair just grabbed my headset. All right. Okay, so Judges chapter number 8. So here's what we're going to be dealing with tonight. And you'll notice on your outline that it has on there different names, but every one of them has the word either incident or incidents. And so basically there are 5 incidents that take place in Judges chapter number 8. All of them are related, or they flow out of what we were dealing with a couple of weeks ago in chapter 7, as Gideon begins to make the move to deal with the Midianites, who were the oppressors of Israel at this particular time. And so I want to go back and do a little bit of a review as we talk about the Ephraim incident, okay? So I'm going to go back and do a little bit of review. So remember in chapter number 7, you've got Gideon, and he ends up, as he gets ready to go and attack Midian and deal with them, remember he has this massive army that he goes and attacks Midian with. Remember? Remember how big his army was? Yeah, 300. That's a massive army, isn't it? And it was reduced from at least 22,300. We know that was the minimum number of guys that originally showed up. But 22,000 of them left the very first time because they were afraid and so forth. And then they were put down by the water, and there was a check for, it was a test of discipline. You know, who just put their face down in water and drank it, and then who were the ones that lapped like a dog. In other words, they used their hand, but they remained vigilant. They were on the watch all the time, and so they demonstrated discipline. And so it was those 300 men that were chosen. And so they're divided up and into 3 groups. They had, remember what their instruments were? They had horns in one hand, and then they had a torch and a clay jar in the other, and most likely the clay jar had a hole in the bottom of it. The torch went through it, hiding the flame inside there. And by the way, oxygen would have been somewhat limited, and so the flame probably would not have been burning as brightly while it's inside the clay jar. But then they would have smashed those together, breaking the jars, making it sound like, you know, if you've ever been in a place where you've got a large number of military personnel assembled, and if they're standing at ease and they're given the order attention, and they suddenly, all of them together at one time, make that move and come to attention, they snap up, you hear it. Well, the jars being smashed would have given the impression of that there is a large number of soldiers out there moving. It would have sounded like footsteps on the ground, crashing and breaking twigs and grass and so forth and so on. And then suddenly these flames would have shown up, and the trumpets were blowing and so forth. And so they go on the attack. And remember, it's at nighttime, and so and that created chaos among the Midianites, and they basically ended up turning on each other. And they started killing each other. Then they started running. And so the reason why I pointed out the city of Nain is that is where, up there in Issachar, the green section of the map, that's where the Midianites were originally located, okay, where they had kind of taken a stronghold in Israel. And then, of course, we have the 300 blowing the trumpets, and they're breaking the jars and so forth and so on. And then the men of Israel, they call Asher and Naphtali and Manasseh to come and join the pursuit. And they pursue them. And then we look at verse number 24 of chapter 7. And it says, and Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim. So finally, he also comes to a place to where they reach a point where he calls additional Israelites into the battle, kind of late in the battle, Ephraim, all right? And it says he calls them, verse 24, come down against the Midianites and seize from them the watering places as far as Beth Barah and the Jordan. And so here's what happened. When the Midianites, after the initial battle, a lot of that army began to run southeast from Issachar down towards the Jordan. Remember I showed you where Sukkoth was located? They start running in that direction. And so Gideon calls on the Ephraimites to join in the chase as they're making their way towards the Jordan, all right? So they get in there, and it says in the latter part of verse 25, they captured 2 princes, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. Now, got a question for you, all right? So they killed these 2 princes of the Midianites. And they killed one at the rock of Oreb and the other one at the winepress of Zeb. Why do you think that those names are what they are? The rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb. What's the point of those names? Okay, but what else? What's happening here? What are they talking about? They're talking about the slaying, the death of these two princes, right? Here's what it's telling you. There was a big rock out there somewhere. That's where he got killed. And there was a wine press. This other dude probably tried to hide in the wine press, like Gideon was at the front end. He dies there, all right? That's the reason why that rock was named after Oreb and the wine press after Zeb. That's where they were killed. And so then we pick up in chapter 8, verse number 1, all right? So it says, now the men of Ephraim said to him, that is to Gideon, why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites? And notice the statement, and they reprimanded him sharply. Verse 2, so he said to them, what have I done in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezar? And so what's happening here is this. The Ephraimites are upset with Gideon because he didn't call them initially when he did, when he called Asher and Naphtali and Manasseh and so forth. And they're upset with him that he didn't include them at the front. And basically he comes back with the statement that he makes, and he says, listen guys, what you did in capturing and killing those two princes is more than all the rest of what I've done. Okay? And verse 3, he says, God has delivered into your hand the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and what was I able to do in comparison with you? Now you can see Gideon's being, what's the word I'm looking for? Diplomatic. He's being diplomatic. That's a good gift to have at times, right? Some folks got it and some folks ain't. But he's being diplomatic because he sees what's going on. So in layman's terms, what would you say is the problem with the men of Ephraim? Their feelings were hurt. Yeah, they're jealous that they weren't called on before, okay? And but they were called out, and they had come and they had joined in with what was going on. Gentlemen, can you all get these ladies some seats for us out there? We'll have to take some out of our classroom back there. Thank you, ladies, for joining us. You're fine. So they joined in the fight, and but here's the thing. The issue that was at hand was jealousy, hurt feelings, wounded pride, and so forth. And that's something we have to be careful of, because jealousy and wounded pride, childishness, I would even say that the way they were behaving was childish. Those kinds of things oftentimes and have greatly hindered the work of God. So, one of the lessons we want to take away from this is, let's not be like the Ephraimites. Don't be childish. Don't be jealous. It's kind of like, it's like this. Let's say, for instance, if as the pastor, we're in Judges chapter 8, ladies. If as the pastor, I say, okay, we want to initiate something, start something new or different. Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to sit down and I'm going to think through who are people in our church family that I believe would be most effective in helping get this thing started and get it off the ground, okay? And so let's say I go to those folks, and I've done this numerous times over the years. I've done it since I've been here, and I enlist some people that I feel impressed would be really good at helping to get this thing going, okay? Well, what the Ephraimites were doing would be like a segment of the church getting all upset and bothered and jealous because I didn't enlist them, as if it is a slight to them. So my point being is this: let's always be bigger than that, because the truth is, if we're not careful, all of us can be subject to that if we're not careful, right? So a very practical lesson that comes from the incident with Ephraim. And then, of course, the conclusion is this. Now, this is in large measure because Gideon handled it well. He could have said, "You big crybaby, grow up." Maybe he should have, I don't know, but he didn't, all right? But because he handled it well, what he managed to do was to work through an issue and what could have become a greater rift, and the way he handled it helped them settle it within their heart and let go of it. And they said this was their conclusion. Now remember, they initially reprimanded him harshly, but their response was in the latter part of verse 25. Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. In other words, kind of like they're saying, well, when you put it that way, we're cool. And you said we did more than you did? Well, that's pretty cool, all right? So we're good with that. Let's move on. So that incident was settled. But then we moved to the next incident that we see here in the text, and it's the Sukkoth and Midianite incidents. Now, I put those two together because all of this is kind of intermingled as it unfolds in these verses right here, in verses 4 through 21. And so we begin at verse number 4, and it says, when Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted but still in pursuit. Here's one of the things that dawned on me as I was reading over that this morning. Now, initially, the Midianites had an army of 100,000 plus. I mean, they had a big army, all right? The confusion of the initial attack, they basically killed each other off, and then the Israelites chased them, and they killed off even more of them. But then you come back to this verse right here, and here's Gideon continuing on. He started out with how many men? 300. And he still got how many men? 300. Somebody's watching out for him, right? God's watching out for him. And so they went on, and they came to the Jordan, and they crossed over the Jordan, exhausted, but still in pursuit. And then he said to the men of Sukkoth. Now, so remember, down there in Gad that I was pointing out a few minutes ago, across the Jordan, that first little village city that was crossed there is Sukkoth, all right, the one I pointed out a few minutes ago. That's where they're at. And they're just east of the Jordan River. And here's what he says to them. Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. The princes, their sons are dead. Now we're chasing after the kings, their fathers, to take them out. Now my question is this for you. When he comes to the people of Sukkoth and he says, give my men some bread and water, some nourishment, some refuge, and so forth. What was Gideon asking for? What was he asking the people to do? Wayne? Yeah, actually, he was asking for aid for his men, right? And so here's the thing. So what was the basis of that request? Now think about this. All right, where's he at? He's over here in the east, in the Transjordan. Remember where the half tribe of Manasseh and Gad and so forth, those three tribes that settled on that side over there. But he's still among Israelites, okay? So the basis of his request was this, that number one, the need was legitimate. Love your neighbor. Number two, these are their brethren. They're Israelites. I mean, you would, and not only that, what Gideon and his men were doing in pursuing the Midianites, these oppressors, was also going to be beneficial to these folks over here. Although they had not been in the heat and in the center of the oppression of the Midianites, it was still to their benefit that Gideon and his men do what they're doing and taking out and dealing with the Midianites, all right? So it was a totally totally reasonable and justified request. Well, the people's response is this, verse 6. And the leaders of Sukkoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army? So what are they saying back to Gideon? What was their response? What are they basically saying?
That you got them so they can't get mad and come after us.
Yeah, these guys are bad hombres. And so we don't want to take this chance of getting in trouble there. They didn't want to support Israel in the fight against Midian until the battle was already won. That sounds like people, doesn't it? They don't want to be there to make the sacrifice. And it's kind of like, and I've said this before, Wilkie Green was my defensive line coach when I was in high school. You remember Wilkie? He's our coach. And so he was our defensive line coach. And think about it, if you know, of course, now back in his day, defensive linemen weren't real big, but Coach Wilkie, he used to tell us this. He'd say, you guys want to ride the bus, drink the Coke, date the cheerleaders, and get all the glory, but you don't want to pay the price. I've used that in every church where I've pastored. And so after I got back to Chattanooga and I was up on the mountain, there was a funeral at our church one day, a visitation, and I looked over there across the room, and lo and behold, there's Coach Green. I hadn't seen him in forever. And so I walked up and talked to him and kind of renewed our acquaintance and everything. And I said, Coach Green, I got to tell you something. I said, you remember you used to say this? He said, yeah. I said, I've used it in every church where I've been. And so the people of Sukkoth were just like that. They wanted to benefit from what Gideon and his men were doing, but buddy, they didn't want to take any chances of any sacrifice or help them out. They wanted to avoid risk at all costs, even if it would have been to their detriment. And that had to be discouraging to Gideon, and it was certainly infuriating to them. That was really an insult. And Gideon took it in that manner, because listen to what he has to say. And by the way, I got to say this right here. What you see happening with Gideon and his men is something, if you're going to be involved in ministry, whether it's in the capacity like what I serve in, or you serve in some other capacity as a volunteer in the church, whatever the case may be. And oftentimes we want to start something and we want to initiate something. And oftentimes the very people that we think for sure, I know these folks will be a part of it, they'll let you down. Many times they'll let you down. The very folks that you think would surely support and get on board and be involved, they won't oppose, but they won't help. Sad state of affairs is that's where a lot of believers are today. Verse 7, I said, probably was discouraging to Gideon. It was definitely infuriating. Listen to what he says, verse 7. And I'm just going to read this. We'll come back and we'll talk about this more a little bit later on. So Gideon said, for this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, now listen to this, I will tear your flesh with thorns of the wilderness and with briars. And then he went up from there to Penuel. Now I pointed out on the map again, down here at Gad, this kind of purple section on the right, where across the Jordan, there was Sukkoth. Just a little further out is Penuel. So David goes a little bit further out, looking for help and going after these kings and so forth. And so he comes to Penuel, east of Sukkoth, and he spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Sukkoth had answered. And so he also spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, when I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower. So they obviously had some kind of tower that was of significance to some extent there in Penuel. Verse 10, now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkor. That's even further east in Gad. So you go past Sukkoth, past Penuel, you come to Karkor, okay? And their armies with them, about 15,000, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east, for 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. That was the size of their army when the 300 originally attacked up in Nain. Okay? Verse 11. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogabah, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued, and he took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and he routed the whole army. And then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle from the ascent of Ares. And he caught a young man of the men of Succoth and interrogated him. And he wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. So in other words, here's what he's doing. Gideon has not forgotten the insult and the refusal of the men of Succoth to come to their aid. He finds this young man who was a part of that, and he interrogates him. That's another word for waterboard. And he gets the name of the principal leaders who were behind all of that. Okay? And then verse 15. And then he came to the men of Succoth and he said, Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your hand that we should give you bread? You wanted to know, are they are in my possession. Here they are in the flesh. All right? And verse 16, and he took the elders of the city, these 77 men, and thorns of the wilderness, and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them, I love this, he taught the men of Succoth. Reminds me of the way I got taught sometimes when I was a kid, all right? And so here's what he did. He basically went out and he found vines, thorns, briars, and made whips out of them. And he whipped them with that. Then he goes on verse 17. And then he tore down, I'm convinced that Gideon did not believe in vengeance is mine, says the Lord, all right? He wasn't practicing that. And then he tore down the tower of Penuel and he killed the men of the city. And we don't have an explanation as to why. The tower was of some kind of strategic significance, no question about that. It may be that the men of Penuel may have resisted with an armed resistance, and it precipitated this. But for whatever reason, he killed them. And so you got two groups of people who, when they thought it was to their advantage and they had the upper hand, they were boastful, arrogant, haughty, bully-like. Kind of reminds me of a Jim Croce song. Bad Leroy Brown. Learned a lesson about messing with the wife of a jealous man. Or Big Jim Walker.
You know, Brother Steve, you think about that. You got 300 men chasing 15,000. And they had to think that ain't going to be very good for 300 men. But they failed to realize when God's leading you, he could do it with no mean problem.
And it's a reminder of the scripture that says that the Lord's hand is not shortened to save by many or by few. Don?
This is a far cry from the meek and cowardly Gideon that's in the winepress.
Oh, isn't it though?
I mean, listen to what he said there. You know, I'm coming back and I'm going to tear your flesh off of your body. But he had to have a fleece 2 times to prove that that was what he was supposed to do. And once he was convinced, he didn't turn back.
And it also comes back to what I said from the very get-go. When you go all the way back to the beginning of the account of Gideon's ministry, was how God greeted him about, you go in this valor of yours. And remember what I said? God was speaking to Gideon not of how Gideon was, but of how God saw Gideon becoming, or what he saw Gideon to become. And here's the reality is, guys, God deals with us in the same way. You think that our failures and shortcomings and weaknesses and fears and anxieties, that any of that's new to him? And it's just another example of how God majors on doing extraordinary things with ordinary people. The difference is just being available. And how I wish that more believers would come to understand that and grasp that. Brother Wayne?
Does anyone think that the 300 of Gideon had anything to do with the 120,000 Midianites dying? They had no sword. I mean, we saw
No, by and large.
they had the chauffeur, and they had if you will, the lantern, or maybe a torch, and then a bucket to cook. All those people that died there were slain by Yahweh God.
Yeah, I mean, God was the warrior there. There's no question about that. In the confusion, they turned on one another and so forth. And we talked about the last time we were together. The only weapons that they had in their hand at that time. Now, as it went forward and they were pursuing, they likely had weapons in their hand of some kind. But initially, when they made that initial approach to the camp of the Midianites, they had no sword. There's no record of them having a sword in their hand. They just simply had what God told them to take. And that's all God asks any of us to do, is just simply take what he's given us as we are and make ourselves available and just be willing to trust him and be used of him. And so then verse number 18, and he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? He's got something very specific in mind about an act that they executed. And they answered, as you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king. Now, we were just talking about the demeanor of Gideon. When we're first introduced to him, he doesn't appear to have the demeanor of the son of a king. But now you look at where he is now. And so he said to them, verse number 19, basically what he was saying, what these kings were saying to him is, they resembled you, they looked like you. Verse 19, he said to them, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. And so apparently these two kings were guilty for the death of Gideon's brothers. And obviously you can see one reason why he was so intent in pursuing them and bringing them to justice, so to speak. And as the Lord lives, he says, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. And he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise and kill them. But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. And so Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise yourself and kill us, for as a man is, so is his strength. They deserved death, and they knew they deserved death, and they encouraged their executioner. So his Jether did not do so. So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. Now these are kings. All right, and these aren't any ordinary camels. These would have been the best breed of camels and so forth. And they wore these crescent ornaments on their neck. And why does he take them? Two things. Number one, evidence that he killed and subdued these kings. Number two, he took them as spoils because they're made of some form of precious metal, gold, silver, some jewels, whatever, we don't know for sure, but they were worth considerable money.
Moon worshipers, and they still have that on their flag today.
Yeah, well, definitely they were, absolutely. And so then we come to the last incident, and let me try to get this done here in just the next few minutes. And really this is kind of a twofold thing here concerning Gideon. Verses 22 to 28 is Gideon's ephod. The men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us. And he says, not going to rule over you. You've delivered us from Midian. Verse 23, he says, I'll not rule over you. I will not. My son will not rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. And so he is rejecting this position of authority and rule. And then he says, he makes a request. Give me the earrings from his plunder. Each man give him his earrings from his plunder. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And so they answered, we will gladly give them. And they spread out a garment, and each man threw into the earrings from his plunder. And the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. And then on top of that were additional things that were donated. And the gold alone basically added up to 50 pounds of gold. I don't know what the rate of gold is today, but, you know, that's a pretty good sum of money, wouldn't you say? 1.4 million. All right, so you just think 1.4 million back in those days, what that was. And it was quite a fortune. And then Gideon made it into an ephod. And this is where the problem comes in. He made it into an ephod, and he set it up in his city, Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Now, ephod was a shirt-like garment that priests would wear. It was used in discerning God's will. And we don't know exactly why he did it. He just said, no, I'm not going to be king over you. I'm not going to be ruler over you. Some suspect that what he was really more interested in was assuming a role of priest, which was not his to do. But in any event, it gets set up in his hometown, not just simply worn, but set up, and it becomes an idol. And to a people that are prone to worship idols, that's the last thing that they needed. I think Gideon probably, it's one of those kinds of things where he meant well, but it wasn't thought through very well. And it ended up becoming a stumbling block to Israel and to his own family. And so in that sense, Gideon, with his public ministry ending in that way, is an example of how, you know what, there are two ways things can go. Sometimes we can start and do really well, and then all of a sudden at the end, mess up really bad. That's kind of the way Gideon's public ministry ended. And then there are those who don't do so well in the beginning, they end well. Ending well is more, doing well across the board is really what you want to shoot for. But he didn't end well. And the last part that I want to mention there is simply the death of Gideon. It says, then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. He got kind of confident as he got older, didn't he? Yeah. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, bore him a son named Abimelech. Now Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age. He was buried in the tomb of Joash's father in Ophrah, the Abiezrites. And so it was that as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. Where's the gratitude? And as we see in every one of these cycles, as we continue through it, the downward spiral continued for Israel. Wayne?
I was reading somewhere, of course, we know that Gideon says he didn't want to be king, but he did take the booty of the king. And his 70th son was born by his concubine. Abimelech means, my father is king. What happened next?
Well, there's probably some wishing that he probably had taken the role, you know. All right, any other thoughts, comments before we conclude? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think it's a story that repeats itself a lot when, we try to serve God and we start humble. We think that He cannot use us, but then it goes up to our head.
Yeah, it's
And the Lord takes no time to bring us back down to where we need to be and make us be part of history, but not leaving a trace behind to be remembered. So we have a moment of shine and bright light out there, and then He takes us down when when He goes up to.
success is a good thing. Success in ministry, as an individual, as a church, it's always a good thing. You want to be successful, but you have to be careful. It can become blinding. We all need in some way, and of course we have the Holy Spirit, but we oftentimes need other people to be with us. Oftentimes, when the Romans, they would bring their generals in this big parade, and they would be coming into the city and they would be riding in their chariot and so forth, and somebody would be holding the wreath, but oftentimes there would be someone behind them that would be saying this: remember, thou art but a man. Don't get too big for your britches. All right, we will conclude with that, and thank you for joining us online. Have a good evening. Now I'm going to turn it over to Brother Randy.